Hello, everybody. I'm Kostas Flokos, the CEO of Upcom. Upcom is a digital transformation innovation provider. We help our clients improve their position in this highly competitive market with technological ideas, tools, and solutions that make them better. And they make it better both internally and externally. Internally with their own people, their employees, collaborators, partners, and externally with end users, clients, or other collaborating organizations. What I'm about to present is a process that we use internally to find innovative solutions to our clients' problems. It's not really useful in cases the specifications are well set and the management has already decided on everything and they simply want an implementation without a risk. If that's your case, use plain PM2 and you'll be fine. But if you need something different, something that will make the difference to you and your users, continue watching the presentation. Looking at the subtitle, you might think that my presentation is focused on how our clients may create better products. Fortunately, the same methodology may be used to improve services, the cornerstone of every successful customer experience towards any client. But when we organize our services, they become products. Products that we don't necessarily sell to clients, but products that we use successfully to enhance the experience of our clients. Let's see now what is the foundation of this methodology and how we employ it in our projects. To enhance creativity, most importantly, to be able to understand the real needs and desires of the final user of the product or service, we're using the design thinking methodology. But design thinking is not a project management methodology. It may not be used to control the process, to be certain that we follow our original promises to our internal or external clients. This is where PM2 comes in, to provide the project management methodology that will help us make this methodology a service, like a product to our clients. PM2 gives us the ability to make our new service a well-defined product that can be offered to clients with clear characteristics, well-defined scope, and eventually pricing requirements. We call this service Think It Up. And we're proud being the first ones offering a powerful, innovation-oriented methodology, such as the design thinking in a project management envelope. And our first experience with internal and external clients has provided us with amazing results. Anyone using this service seems better customer engagement, satisfaction, overall happiness. And a happy customer is a returning customer. The foundation of our new service is the design thinking methodology, as we said before. From its definition, it's composed of 5 well-identified steps. At first, the empathy step, the team's efforts are in understanding the way the user of the product or service feels. It's a very sentimental step. One may consider it the step of the therapist. Well, then we try to define the problem, the definition step. If we don't know the problem, we can't find a solution. Understanding the problem opens up lots of ideas of its solution. And then we move to the next step, the ideation. At the end of this step, the most promising solution is selected and is then prototyped. During the prototype step, the team creates functional mockups, MVPs, something to show to the end users how the proposed solution will work. And during the last step of the process, the testing, we ask the users to evaluate the prototype and give us feedback. As you can understand, the methodology allows lots of alternative paths, repeated efforts to reach the best possible outcome. It is therefore required to be able to go back to the prototyping step to correct a prototype that is not what the users wanted. Don't be surprised, though, if occasionally you are forced to revisit the empathy step in the beginning of the process. Possibly we didn't understand well the user's feelings during that step, and we have to repeat it, restarting in essence the process. Ideally, we want to run the steps once, get the best outcome with the minimum effort. Design thinking, though, is worried only about the best possible outcome. This is our focus. We need to control the effort, though, the overall project budget. Otherwise, the process may run out of fuel before it's even completed once. And this is where PM2 comes in, to monitor and control the entire process, both overall and its distinct steps. PM2, as you may be very well aware, puts in place 5 phases in order to monitor and control any project. At first, the initiation phase, where the project is defined, resources are committed, and management approvals are collected. The next phase, the planning, a best bet effort is made to estimate the time and resources needed to complete each of the design thinking steps. We typically estimate here the number of prototypes created. This is our experience, as well as the possibility of returning back to previous steps, and eventually going back to the empathy step. Some problems are easier than others, and our estimates should follow this initial feeling we have for the problem in hand. Then we do let the design thinking process execute. We closely monitor the methodology in steps and frequently implement steps as mini PM2 projects with an identified start and end phases. Finally, when the process has given the expected results, we must close the project and report its results. Well, sometimes the results can be a complete failure, and a satisfactory solution to the problem cannot be found. Now, during all those phases, the monitor and control phase of PM2 runs in parallel, making sure everything is under control. And here's a combined process. We start with the 2 PM2 phases, where we actually define the project and prepare for its execution. We continue with the execution phase, containing the entire design thinking process. Internally, and during the prototype phase, we frequently launch a PM2 agile project to better manage the implementation of the prototype. That's not always required, but occasionally we do. During the execution, we allow going back and forth in the design thinking steps, but we always manage and control them using the PM2 methodology. Regular reporting allows us to stay whether we proceed with the project or it's about to start thinking about ending it. The closure phase allows us to capitalize on the outcome of the process, even when it's negative. The monitor and control phase runs across the process as usual. Now, in the following slides, we'll go through each step of the combined process. During the first step, the initiation, we try to create a high-level definition of the project and get management approval. It may seem awkward to try to scope a project that by nature is very difficult to put in boundaries. We want innovation. Therefore, it's a mistake to assume a complete serial execution of the design thinking steps. Depending on the problem in hand, we at Upcom estimate the number of back steps that will be required to perform before we are able to reach an acceptable solution. It's not an exception to assume at least two different prototypes being developed with respective testing, while in some cases we even estimate that the first empathy step will not succeed. We know the clients, that's how we can get that information. Therefore, we are obliged to read most of the remaining steps in order to achieve something important for the organization. Now, even though PM2 allows modification in the scope and budget of the project after this initial phase, we have found that properly estimating the maximum required effort from the beginning helps executing the process smoothly and with no risk in interruptions. Now, moving to the planning phase, we quickly realize how important that phase was. I'm not going to bother you with the details of the phase, but will provide you some examples of issues we face when we undervalued this phase. Projects like the Think It Up service may involve many and unrelated stakeholders. There is a need to talk to real users and engage them later during testing. We need to have experts in place when the prototypes needs to be realized. Management frequently wants to view intermediate results, as most of these projects are important for the organization and have high internal visibility. What if any of those stakeholders are not booked well in advance for their participation? Well, it's better to book their availability well in advance and possibly discharge them later if the process completes earlier, than expect to have them available instantly at the next step of the design thinking methodology. Proper planning has saved us months and allowed us to continue the process, even when we thought we need another 2 or 3 full iterations to get something interesting. Now, the next step, we're entering the execution phase of PM Square. It's at the same time the first step of design thinking methodology. During this step, we try to understand the user needs, feel the way he or she feels with the problem in hand. We try to become one of them. How many times one of you talked to a user who said, I want this, to find out after a short discussion that the user had another deeper problem in mind, but tried to express it in a way that was misleading? So many cases when users came to us with a technical solution already drafted. We have no idea by whom. And then they insisted we should implement it. In the past, we were afraid to question it and simply implemented it. In some cases, the results were horrifying. Complete solutions, well implemented, never used by anyone. The problem we were supposed to solve was neither solved by the solution, or the users found another, simpler, easier solution and refused to use the implemented one. Or maybe we're trying to solve the wrong problem. Well, today things are different. Aside from some unfortunate failures, we do manage to discuss with our future clients and persuade them. And we realize that frequently the problem is a different one than the description the client gave us initially. It's easy in those cases to blame the user or client for wrong information and imply that they don't know what they want. I would like to repeat here what I frequently tell to my colleagues. If the client is not able to express the requirements properly, the problem is ours, not his. We're doing something wrong. It's our responsibility to understand the client, to empathize with him. And this is the role of the first step of the design thinking methodology. We try to talk with the client and all involved party stakeholders. We need to observe them when trying to solve the problem in hand, when they act on something, when they decide on a question. And we need to put ourselves in their shoes to feel, to sense how these users react to their environment when they face a problem. We are close then to understand the real problem and how the users and other stakeholders want it to be solved. Only then can we move to the next step and define the requirements of the solution. Now, having completed the in-depth interactions with the various stakeholders, it's time to set the requirements of the solution. It corresponds to the traditional user requirements document, but we borrow the user story template from the Agile community to describe the high-level user interactions. Those interactions compose at the end the various user journeys that the future system should satisfy. And as with any user story that we need to draft, we start by identifying the roles, the personas, that will interact with the future solution. We start drafting the high-level user stories, where the user, persona is present, their user needs expressed with a verb, user X wants to do something, and then finally the reason for that, in order to achieve this or that. And then we use this last part of the sentence to map each user story to the original problems and desires of the users, as expressed in the previous step of the design thinking process. My personal experience is that this first sub-step, as identified in this process, is frequently the last, or at least the last in multiple rounds of user stories, refinements to reach the desired result. It is also obvious that all users engaged in the first step of the design thinking methodology should certainly review and approve the user stories divided in this step. Our experience has shown that those two first steps of the methodology are executed in parallel. I'm talking about the empathy and the definition. As soon as we understand the users, we start defining the requirements. But when we review them with the users, we realize that possibly we didn't understand the problem well. So we need new meetings, new inspections of their activity, new efforts to put ourselves in their shoes. And then only that we are able to define the high-level requirements and how the system will work. Now, additionally, depending on the size of the project, we may simply focus on the most important issues first and deal with the details later on. I would like to remind you that we don't generally use this combined process for obvious projects. Well, is any project obvious, you may ask me, but I'll leave it up to you to reflect on that. Therefore, what we occasionally do in very large projects is we use the design thinking steps for the core issues in a project, and we discuss details of specific user stories with the subject expert to gain some time in the implementation. It's not always the best solution, as even the smallest detail in an interaction with end users may have a detrimental effect in the relationship of the organization with them. I have tons of examples where the core functionality is excellent, well thought, properly elaborated with end users, and the overall customer experience unique, but some parts of it are simply not what the users want. And frequently, the number of users wanting that part of the functionality is small, so it's a trade-off. Do you have the money and resources to use design thinking throughout the entire set of requirements? If you do, then go ahead. If not, then at least use it for the functionality that the majority of the users will repetitively use. And then we move to the next step, the ideation step. We try to specify how the system will work in order to solve the problem defined previously. We start by the user stories composing the user journeys and brainstorm in order to find possible solutions. We build more fine-grained user stories, more technical ones, try to describe the functionality. It looks like an easy step, but trust me, most of the time we spend it here, trying to find the best possible solution for a problem in hand. Lots of brainstorming methods exist out there, we use them all. We frequently do. Then we map the more technical user stories that we described in the previous step to users' journeys to make sure they serve something. So we don't have user stories that came out of our brainstorming session that don't serve anything. And we do the opposite to make sure that all the requirements expressed in the user journeys are satisfied by the more technical user stories. And then at this phase, you should already have a short list of acceptance criteria for every technical user story. Not all the details, the exceptions, etc., but the core criteria that make sense for the end users. Based on that story mapping, we are then able to select the ones that are critical for the success of the project. This selection frequently makes or breaks the entire effort. I was reviewing a project recently, and the technical team had put an enormous effort to implement the user stories that they believed were the most important for the project. And when they showed it to the end users, well, it was a complete disappointment. Almost nobody was interested in that functionality. It was useful, but was not solving the core problem of the user. Starting with that, the most important, the ones that will make the user support you. Mock other parts that are possibly needed to offer the functionality. Make a reasonable selection of the user stories to implement. The result of this selection will be the product backlog that the team will prototype during the next step of the methodology. Refine the acceptance criteria in this sub-step according to the user needs and desires. Remove the parts with low importance and focus on the ones that will make the user happy, the ones that will excite the end users. Now, in this step of the design thinking methodology, everyone is invited to participate. Users, consultants, technical persons, managers. When solutions tend to be more technical, the leading role is given to the technical team, and users feel distant from the process. Members of the technical team are mandatory, as we can't have specifications that are not technically feasible. Depending on the project, you should be able to estimate the involvement of each stakeholder during this step and make sure you properly take into account the planning phase of the project, as we talked before. The next step in the design thinking methodology is the prototyping. It is a typical implementation of a project that has been properly specified in the previous steps. But as we normally talk about a prototype, the total effort is small enough to not justify a proper process. Occasionally, the results are not even full-blown versions of a software. Now, if the total estimated effort justifies it, we typically encapsulate this as a PM2 Agile sub-project that runs inside the overall process. But as I said, this is not mandatory. What's important to note is that this step is mainly devoted to the technical team with the necessary interaction with the user's representative, the product owners, as we call it in another context. Now, after the implementation of the prototype, the testing is of extreme importance. It's a moment of truth. After lots of discussions, brainstorming activities, reviews, technical work, the users, and not the technical team, have to try the prototype and make sure the solution is what they need to solve their original problem. Obviously, the major decisions to continue to the next step of the methodologies are taken after this test. That's why this test is thorough and across all stakeholders. We test whether it solves the fundamental problem identified in the first steps. We test whether the end users are happy enough with the solution proposed. We test whether stakeholders find the solution acceptable. Now, if the solution is not successful at any point, then the decision to go back to previous steps of the methodology is taken. As I said before, we expect going back a few times. We can't be perfect with one shot. Don't be afraid for that, it's normal, but plan it if possible in advance and don't expect a smooth transition from start to end without any backtracking. Now, if the test is successful, then the entire process is normally completed. The definition of the solution is complete and the organization may start its proper implementation as a normal software project. In this case, the process continues with the next phase of the process and the new project is launched with much clearer specifications. Well, at Upcom, we prefer to continue the implementation of the project inside the same process, the same design thinking up process, with the same resources that have worked in the innovation project. It is always better. In typical project management terms, that can be achieved in the original project planning, but unfortunately, it's very difficult to manage that and predict all the cases. That's the reason we avoid implying that the original project plan will contain the implementation part as well. But PM2 allows extending the scope of our project, and we use that technique to retrofit the project, the prototype, and the testing phases, which may now be renamed to implementation. Now, the decision whether to go to a new project or to retrofit it to the existing project is a pure management decision. And what are their intentions? Finishing the design thinking process, we arrive to the phase of the closure of the project. We have to put attention to this this phase because it's a very important one. I can only say that just by the lessons learned task, we have managed to gain significant time in future projects, and in some cases even win bids based on justified experience. Do follow these steps, they are really important. I would like to close with a small definition of the phase 5 of PM2 that is so important even in those innovation-driven projects. These are the tasks that run throughout the entire project lifecycle. First, the ability to control the schedule guarantees availability of resources. Frequently, non-technical are the most difficult to commit. Risk management is so important. The ideas that come in a brainstorming session explode the risks. They are everywhere and frequently unexplored, with no previous experience how to deal with them. Managing transition is not something that we have discussed in the past, but this is something that we typically take into account during the execution phase. While the focus is in the innovation today, transition management is a big chapter worth a separate presentation. Controlling the cost is fundamental as well. How many projects have been stopped because of lack of fuel? You have to monitor during these flexible projects and make sure you get approvals early enough to guarantee continuation of a project that is close to a beautiful outcome. Without that, the project may fail just before the end. Keep track of everything to prove, if needed, that resources in fact have been used optimally, No management wants to find out that the project overspent, even when the results are wonderful. And finally, manage change, which may pop up at any phase and step. A proper change management will make the project less vulnerable to slip-offs, unnecessary delays, over budget, etc. Thank you so much for following this presentation. I'm Kostas Flokos, and you should be able to find me easily on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook. If you want to find more information about our Think It Up service, visit our website at www.upcom.eu and express your interest for a meeting. Thank you again.